Okay, welcome back. This is the last of the three video clips of the central nervous system. I'm going to finish it up now. So I covered the last two videos were just a review of the spinal cord and the brain up to the point at which I covered in class. And now I'm going to finish up the unit with this last clip here. And, if at any moment something's confusing, pause it, go look it up. You have your internet at your resource as a resource. You also have your textbook as a resource. So now some good practice in figuring stuff out on your own, which you're going to have to do in college if that's your next step here. Okay, so let's get back into the brain. So we talked about the cerebrum already, which is this top portion here, the human brain. We talked about the basal ganglia, which is like the editor of our movements. And then we started talking about this middle portion called the diencephalon. Diencephalon has a lot going on. So I'm focusing on a portion of it. So this part here that we're going to be talking about is the limbic system. And the limbic system involves the hippocampus, which we're going to talk about, that deals with memory. There's also the amygdala there. And the amygdala is the emotional center of the brain. That is the little structure that triggers the fight or flight response and allows us to survive. So in dangerous situations, the amygdala takes over and puts us into a physical ability to escape or fight or whatever it is that we need to do to get out of that situation. There are some other things going on here, though, so let's take a look at them. The next portion of the diencephalon I want to focus on is going to be the small structure back here called the pineal gland. Now, the pineal gland is a small pine cone-shaped gland, which is why it's called the pineal gland. And I'll start by telling you what we do know about it, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the speculation and some of the kind of out there ideas that go along with it. So here's what we do know about the pineal gland. The pineal gland releases a hormone called melatonin. And melatonin, if you've ever laid in bed, ready to fall asleep, you get this very warm, relaxed feeling. All of your muscles kind of relax. You feel your head kind of sink back into the pillow. That is melatonin at work. It gives you that drowsy response. You can actually take it as a supplement. I took it for a while. It helps you fall asleep. It's not a drug necessarily as much as it is a supplement because your brain produces it. But it gets released when there's an absence of light. So when the lights go out, your brain starts to produce melatonin because that's when you're supposed to sleep. And then when the lights come back on, you stop producing it, which is why a lot of times people have a hard time sleeping with the lights on. But that's this pineal gland back here. Now, what's kind of wild about it is that if you've ever seen any imagery of like Eastern religions where there's someone meditating and they may be sitting in a lotus position, and then you'll see an image of a pine cone kind of just floating over their head. That image is tied directly into this gland here because it's pine shaped. That's where that pine cone image comes from. They call it the third eye because it actually has a retina, and a retina there is there to take light information and interpret it. So it's odd that you would have a retina in the middle of your brain when your eyes are up here, but they tie that into the evolutionary past where, initially this might have been something that allowed small organisms that use photosynthesis that were aquatic. They could go up and down in the water depending on time of day. So when the sun was out, that triggered the light, that triggered this structure to have that organism go towards the light. And then when the light was out, it would go away. And that's why we still have that connection today. I'm going to tie in a video on sleep, and they're going to talk about that. The second gland in this slide is the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is really working for the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sits just below the thalamus, and that is the homeostatic center of the brain. It keeps track of all of your levels, and when it needs to, it will kick the pituitary gland into action to regulate those levels. So, for example, when you hit puberty, you grew. That was the human growth hormone. That is produced by the pituitary gland. So it's called pituitary growth hormone because it comes from here. It's also tied in with all of your other glands. So it's often called the master gland. If we have time, I'm going to get to a small endocrine system unit, and we'll talk more about that then. But the pituitary gland really is working for the hypothalamus, and it's going to keep, it's what produces testosterone. It's what triggers the release of an egg during menstruation. So all of that is going to be tied in with the pituitary gland. Memory. Now, this is a topic that I find fascinating. We still really don't understand the mechanism behind memory, but here's what we do know. The hippocampus is the part of the brain which is in the diencephalon, which is going to allow us to take short-term memory and convert it to a long-term memory. So this is one of the few examples in science where they name something appropriately. Hippocampus means seahorse, and this is a hippocampus right here, and this is a seahorse. And I gotta say, they kind of nailed it. This thing looks like a little tiny seahorse. And when someone damages their hippocampus, you can't make long-term memory. So that's how we know that that's its job. So basically, when you think about memory, there's three types of memory: working memory, short-term memory, long-term memory. Working memory lasts seconds, and that is when information first comes into your brain. It is what's called working memory. You can think of it like RAM on your computer. It's what could be running, in the background, essentially. That only lasts a matter of seconds, and then it gets put into what's called your short-term memory. And then you got about 20 to 30 seconds with it. You can only hold around 7 items in your short-term memory, and unless you put it into long-term memory, it's gone forever. So that is why rehearsal is so important. That's why studying is so important. You can't just hear something and expect to remember it. It'll get lost forever. So short-term memory is only about, like I said, 20 to 30 seconds. So we're not talking about a lot of time there. And that's why phone numbers are only 7 numbers long. That's why if you make a list of groceries, if I gave you 10 things to go to the grocery store, chances are when you get there, you're only going to remember 5 or 6 of them. And that's because your short-term memory isn't built to hold that much information. I'm going to link in a video in the classroom post on this that I'm going to want you to watch about memory, and you'll get a lot of information from there. Hyperthymesia is a condition. I'm going to put that video up as well. It's a very rare condition. It's autobiographical memory. So basically, everything that's ever happened to you your entire life, you remember as if it happened yesterday. It's very rare. They don't understand why or how. It seems kind of cool. Maybe not. There's definitely some things I'm glad I forgot. I don't necessarily want to remember my entire life. So there is a reason why we forget things. There's a purpose to it. You don't want to have every single detail forever. But it would be kind of cool to be able to go back and remember every day of your life. But there's a video clip I'm going to include as well. It's real short. Okay, last bit here. We got the brainstem and the cerebellum. So let's start with the brainstem. The brainstem is your reptile brain, and that is this portion right here coming off of the base of the basal ganglia and the diencephalon. So it's got 3 components: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So I'm going to just talk about each one. So the first part is called the midbrain, and the midbrain is the most superior part of the brainstem. It sits right here, and the significant structure there is called the corpora quadrigemina. So what does the midbrain do? Well, first off, it's the pathway from the cerebrum down to the spinal cord. So obviously, it's a way station, information traveling down. As these neurons pass through here, they go down through the midbrain, the pons, and then eventually out to the spinal cord. But the corpora quadrigemina is actually a structure. It's made up of 4 components. That's why it's called quadrigemina. I'm not going to get into the exact details, but the superior colliculus, that is part of it. There's an inferior and superior colliculus. They sit right here, and that is responsible for keeping your eyes and your head together when you turn your head. So, big deal, right? What's that all about? Well, basically, if let's say there was a loud noise off to your right, you would hear that noise and you would turn towards that noise and your eyes would be trained on it. Okay, everyone try this real quick. Keep your eyes straight ahead. Now turn your head to the right, but keep your eyes straight ahead. And now do the same thing to the left. Feels weird, right? Because our brains are hardwired to have our eyes and our head move together. That is the corpora quadrigemina that is doing that. Is that significant for us? Not so much, but if we get to do the sheep brain dissection, I'll point out they have a huge corpora quadrigemina because sheep spend their entire lives looking over their shoulders, hoping they don't get eaten by a wolf or some other larger mammal. So animals that are prey animals have very well developed corpora quadrigemina. We don't worry about that, so ours is not that impressive, but that's why it's hard to sneak up on an animal. They have that part of their brain very well developed. So that's called the corpora quadrigemina. The pons, there's not a whole lot to say about the pons. The pons really is just it's the cerebellum's back here, the cerebrum's up here. That's where your motor cortex is. A lot of information's got to pass through there. So think of the pons as basically the way station between the cerebellum and the cerebrum up here. So that's really all you need to know about the pons. It's in terms of finding it, it's easy to identify. It's this bulged out portion of the brainstem, but it's basically just that way station. And then finally, we have our medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is is the inferior portion of the brainstem before the spinal cord starts. That has some important stuff. So let's go through that. Okay, first off, that is where we're going to find our vital centers of the brain. There's 3 of them. There's the cardiac center, the vasomotor, and the respiratory. The cardiac center is responsible for your heart rate. The vasomotor is responsible for causing your blood vessels to dilate and constrict. If you need to increase or decrease your blood pressure, if you want to have more blood go towards your muscles. And then the respiratory center is going to control your breathing. So, as your oxygen demand goes up, that'll cause your breathing to increase. And then there's also what are called the non-vital centers, and that's going to be what causes you to cough, sneeze, swallow, all those things that you do that aren't going to keep you alive necessarily. They're non-vital, but they're still important. Last bit of the brainstem is called the reticular formation, and the reticular formation is the reason why you have an alarm clock in the morning. You wake up with an alarm clock. Now, some of you guys might sleep through your alarm clocks, and that's because your reticular formation has basically determined that that is not a danger. So what the reticular formation is, it's a mass of nerve fibers that are spread throughout the brainstem, and it essentially is the on switch for your cerebrum. So your cerebrum is the part of your brain that thinks. So when you're sleeping, your brain's still functioning, your cerebrum's just off, and the reticular formation is what activates the cerebrum into functioning, which is why when you have a teacher that just talks like this in a very monotone voice and doesn't change their tone at all, you fall asleep, because what happens is your reticular formation has determined that is a non-threatening sound and you could fall asleep. When I teach, I'm loud and I'm quiet, I'm loud and quiet, and what that does is it activates your reticular formation, and it keeps it so your brain doesn't know what the deal is, and it can't just ignore you. So the reticular formation has the job of waking up the brain into action. Funnily enough, it actually can do the opposite. Your cerebrum can activate the reticular formation. So think of a time when you're sitting in class and the teacher's droning on and you're making yourself stay awake. That is that example. Let's say somebody has a brain injury where they go into a coma and they can't come out of the coma. That is because the reticular formation has been damaged. And people can get put into a medical induced coma, and that is when someone is actively put into a coma by inhibiting their reticular formation. So if somebody injures themselves and the doctor does not want them to be awake, they can actually shut down the reticular formation chemically, and that person will be in a coma. So coma is caused by the reticular formation getting destroyed. And finally, the last thing, again, this is just on sleep. I'm going to put up a video on sleep and watch the video. I'm not going to go through these notes. Just know the difference between REM sleep and non-REM sleep. Non-REM sleep is what is thought to be when you're resting. That's when you're in your deepest sleep. You sleep in about a 70 to 90 minute cycle. So that first 70 to 90 minutes is going to be what's called non-REM sleep. And then the secondary part is called REM sleep, and that is when your eyes are moving. That's why rapid eye movement is what that stands for. And that's usually only about 5 or 15 minutes. So you're not sleeping for a majority of the night. You're not dreaming for a majority of the night. You're only dreaming in short bursts. Really don't understand sleep. I'm going to put a video up. That's where you'll get that information. And then finally, last bit is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is this last portion here. It's on the back part of the brain. It sits back here. And that is going to be mostly white matter. And there's actually a shape. It's called the arbor vitae, which means tree of life. And if you take a look here, it does kind of look like a tree. And that is going to be like a mini brain on the back of your brain. And its job deals with complex muscle activity. So let's say I had a brain injury and I lost my memory. And I can't make new memories, but I still know how to tie my shoe. I still know how to play guitar. I still know how to shoot a basket. That's because all that is stored back here in the cerebellum. So think of the cerebellum as where we store our complex skeletal muscle activity. So not being able to move your hand, but being able to tie your shoe would be in the cerebellum. You don't think about it anymore. You just do it. Driving a car, you don't think about it. You just do it. That's because that information is stored back here in the cerebellum. So think of that as the part of your brain which is responsible for knowing where you are in space and time, coordinating, so am I standing up? Am I laying down? How far is the wall away? Also, it's responsible for complex movements. And that's it. That's everything. It maintains your posture and your equilibrium. That's all she wrote. All right, guys.